Logicked, in his zeal to mock me, submitted a study in a feeble and ill-conceived attempt to prove me wrong. Unfortunately, Logicked failed miserably, for more than one reason. As a result, I am now loath to use the name Logicked and will henceforth refer to him as Lol. Before I explain why this is an utter failure on Lol's part, first let us hear from Lol himself, lest I be accused of misrepresenting him, strawmanning him, or taking things out of context.
So here are a couple relevant studies. And this, of course, is for the audience's curiosity. Kevin isn't going to care about this, and nobody cares. So these studies provide evidence that the brain states under belief and disbelief are quite different from those under what's typically called in these studies uncertainty, and more similar to each other than they are to uncertainty. Now, I'm not a huge fan of how the words certainty and uncertainty are used in these studies. The standard seems to be to not use it as I would use it, to refer to that unshakable feeling of I cannot possibly be wrong, but instead a sliding scale of confidence where you can have more certainty or less certainty. And uncertain really just means undecided or having insufficient confidence to accept the truth or falsehood of a proposition. In other words, nonbelief. It's important to keep this distinction in mind and to interpret the word as intended by the authors when it appears.
First and foremost, I do care, because I actually read the study. In fact, I've cited the study in my videos, in my book Objecting to the Absence of Belief, and will again in my forthcoming book, The Nude Atheism. Before we see whether your interpretation matches what Harris's co-authors actually say, I think it's worth pointing out that prior to presenting the study, you say, quote, "Now, I'm not a huge fan of how the words certainty and uncertainty are used in these studies. The standard seems to be not to use it as I would use it, to refer to that unshakable feeling of, I cannot possibly be wrong." That's correct. We can see that standard usage supported by a multitude of sources, which I have repeatedly cited. For example, Dr. Eric Schwitzgebel, writing for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, explains, "We might suppose that every subject holds each of their beliefs with some particular degree of confidence. In general, the greater the confidence one has in a proposition, the more willing one is to depend on it in one's actions. One common way of formalizing this idea is by means of a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 indicates absolute certainty in the falsity of the proposition, 1 indicates absolute certainty in its truth, and 0.5 indicates that the subject regards the proposition just as likely to be true as false. This number then indicates one's credence or degree of belief. Thus, one can believe or disbelieve, and to different degrees. Crucially, contrary to the perpetual straw man of my position, I don't dispute that people can not believe claims. I don't believe an array of claims are true, because I believe they're untrue. The point of contention is whether or not there's a difference between not believing a claim is true and believing that it's false. You still have not demonstrated that, which I'll prove momentarily. But don't feel too bad, because no one else has either, and I've been doing this for years. And to be sure, Schwitzgebel is not alone in the view that belief is a graduated system of credence. All of these sources, which I've repeatedly cited and have been ignored, are in agreement. Anyway, you go on to say, quote, "It's important to keep this distinction in mind and to interpret the word as intended by the authors when it appears." Of course, you then immediately proceed to interpret the word differently. First, quoting the study, uncertainty can be distinguished readily from belief and disbelief in this regard, because in the latter states, the mind has settled on a specific actionable representation of the world. Then saying, quote, "And I think this is an excellent definition of non-belief." Oh, lol, you scamp you. Yet, if we do a keyword search of the study itself, we can see that absence of belief, lack of belief, non-belief, with or without the hyphen, unbelief also with or without the hyphen, and similar phrasing appear nowhere in the paper, nor do Harris and Company draw a connection between uncertainty and non-belief. It's almost as if you just made it up. In fact, what the paper does say is this: contrasting belief and disbelief across all stimulus categories yielded a discrete region of magnetic resonance imaging signal increase in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, specifically in the rostral regions of the gyrus rectus and the orbitomedial gyrus, predominantly in the left hemisphere. A similar pattern of signal changes was detected within certainty of our category specific contrast. The contrast between disbelief and belief showed increased bold signal in the left anterior frontal gyrus, the anterior insula bilateral, the dorsal anterior cingulate extending to the superior frontal gyrus, and in the superior parietal lobule. When compared with both belief and disbelief, judgments of uncertainty were associated with a positive signal change in the anterior cingulate cortex and decreased signal in the caudate. So what we have established is that belief in the proposition causes activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and disbelief in the proposition, or belief in the negation, causes activation in the anterior insula, the dorsal anterior cingulate, and superior parietal lobule, different regions of the brain. We have also established that uncertainty activates the anterior cingulate cortex, again, a different area of the brain. Now pay attention. Nowhere is it established that uncertainty resulted in the non-activation of the VMPFC, anterior insula, the dorsal anterior cingulate, or superior parietal lobule. In fact, in the discussion of uncertainty, those regions of the brain aren't mentioned at all. That's because if belief is quantified by the activation of the VFPFC, and disbelief quantified by activation of the anterior insula, the dorsal anterior cingulate, and superior parietal lobule, then uncertainty activation of the anterior cingulate cortex is additive. Actual non-belief would entail non-activation of those regions with the activation of the anterior cingulate cortex instead of those regions. The study doesn't demonstrate that this occurs. The study doesn't assert that. The study doesn't imply that. The study doesn't even approach suggesting that. Just like the study doesn't equate uncertainty to non-belief. You do. You say that you think that this is an excellent definition of non-belief. Not them, and not anyone else of any significance, as far as I can tell. Oh, lol, you scamp you. I don't care what you think. I don't see any compelling reason why anyone should care what you think either. My arguments are actually supported by academia. Yours are not. Who has more credibility here? And you do that after acknowledging that this usage is not aligned with your own or anyone else's. And after saying that we need to keep their usage in mind when interpreting it. So then why do you immediately strawman Harris and Company by falsely equating certain uncertainty and non-belief? I mean, I've heard of killing two birds with one stone, but committing two logical fallacies with one statement is pretty impressive in its own right. Lowell says uncertainty equals non-belief. Harris and Company say, in phenomenological terms, uncertainty is a state in which a given representation of the world cannot be adopted to be as a guide to subsequent behavior, cognition, or emotional processing. Uncertainty can be distinguished readily from belief and disbelief in this regard because in the latter states, the mind has settled on a specific actionable representation of the world. The results of our study suggest two mechanisms that may account for this difference. What Harris and Company don't say is uncertainty equals non-belief, or uncertainty implies non-belief, or uncertainty precludes belief. Lowell does. That's all Lowell's overactive imagination. And lest this be overlooked, Harris and Company find several psychological studies appear to support Spinoza's conjecture that the mere comprehension of a statement entails the tacit acceptance of its being true, whereas disbelief requires a subsequent process of rejection. Understanding a proposition may be analogous to perceiving an object in physical space. We seem to accept appearances of reality until they prove otherwise. Our behavioral data supports this hypothesis in so much as subjects judge statements to be true more quickly than they judge them to be false or undecidable. This is devastating, for the non-belief is the default position argument that is so often invoked, because if true is the more rapidly given response, indicating belief based on comprehension of the proposition alone, mind you, that makes it that much more difficult to equate uncertainty or undecidedness to genuine absence of belief, because that would entail the subjects initially find the proposition as true based on mere comprehension of it, then under consideration reduce the degree of credence to exactly 0.5, no more and no less. Given the sheer complexity of human cognition being impacted by a wide variety of factors beyond evidence, logical argumentation, and sound reasoning, this is an exceedingly unrealistic expectation. Nonetheless, I invite Lowell and anyone else to continue trying to present actual evidence of a distinction between the dissent to a proposition and the assent to its negation, as this has been, is, and shall remain the singular point of contention. Now, before I end this video, I will say it again. I am not a prescriptivist. Anyone can use any word in any way they choose, and it won't be wrong. Though if you invite your friends over for chocolate ice cream and serve them dog poop with the explanation, well, when I say chocolate ice cream, I mean dog poop, you probably won't have friends for very long. And when you redefine a term in an effort to advance your argument, that is a logical fallacy. Be that as it may, if you really want to define non-belief as a state in which a given representation of the world cannot be adopted as a guide to subsequent behavior, cognition, or emotional processing, those are issues with that definition that must be addressed. Abulimania, the state of pathological indecisiveness, is a real phenomenon. If you insist on defining non-belief in that way, that is what begins to resemble. I'm not suggesting that's literally the case, but the parallel is hard to ignore, and it raises the question of how one distinguishes between them. In effect, you unnecessarily muddy the waters even further. That's unfortunate. Personally, I'd rather believe something in error than to have people think that I suffer from some pathological condition. But that's just me. You do you. But there's a bigger problem. Dr. Richard Jeffrey writes, probabilities are real numbers in the range of 0 to 1, with the endpoints reserved for certainty of falsehood and truth, respectively. So if we equate belief to certainty, we end up with a schema that looks like this. In this schema, the one suggested by Lowell, where non-belief is equal to uncertainty, belief is restricted exclusively to 1, disbelief or belief in the negation is restricted exclusively to 0, and uncertainty or non-belief is the entire range in between. The first problem with that model is that it effectively denies graduated belief, where one can believe propositions to varying degrees. For example, I am certain as I can be of most things that I will not be struck by lightning. Alternatively, I also find it to be more likely to be true than untrue that if I roll a standard 6-sided die, the result will be between 1 and 4, though to a much lower degree of credence. And guess what? That belief is justified because it is more likely to be between 1 and 4. However, under Lowell's model, because my credence for this is not 1, it's not belief because I'm not certain. So then what the hell is it? It's not disbelief because disbelief is just belief in the opposite direction. Now sure, we can call that non-belief, but that leads to the next problem. Belief informs action. Obviously, these degrees of credence that do not reach the poles of 0 and 1 exist. I just demonstrated that. And those degrees of credence still inform behavior. I just demonstrated that too. So even if we decide to label this entire range between 0 and 1 non-belief, we are still left with an appeal to a vacuous truth. Sure, you can then say, I don't believe X, and it doesn't matter because your credence exceeds 0.5, you will still likely behave as if you do believe X, and lo and behold, that's exactly what we see. How do self-identifying strong atheists tend to behave? Well, recognizing that this isn't a monolith and that outliers do exist, so there's no reason to whine about that, strong atheists tend to consume atheistic and anti-theistic media like Lowell's video, learn counter-apologetics or arguments against religion, engage in debate against theistic belief, criticize religion and deride religious persons, support atheist persons, communities, and organizations, avoid attendance at religious services, decline to observe religious holidays, abstain from religious fasting and ritual participation, oppose religious inclusion in public institutions, publicly identify as atheists and advocate that others do likewise, correct others who assume religious belief, and participate in activism for separation of church and state. And how do self-identifying weak atheists who express a mere absence of belief in deities behave? Well, again, recognizing that outliers do exist, they tend to consume atheistic and anti-theistic media like Lowell's video, learn counter-apologetics or arguments against religion, engage in debate against theistic belief, criticize religion and deride religious persons, support atheist persons, communities, and organizations, avoid attendance at religious services, decline to observe religious holidays, abstain from religious fasting and ritual participation, oppose religious inclusion in public institutions, publicly identify as atheists and advocate that others do likewise, correct others who assume religious belief, and participate in activism for separation of church and state. Isn't that strange? Now, sure, you can make the assertions that a distinct state of non-belief exists, that people are in that state, that somehow they are aware of the content of the subconscious mind to know that they're in that state, and that some other belief is informing their behavior. And I will continue to rightfully say that I reject those assertions due to insufficient evidence. In the meantime, I will leave you with the standard schema, which, unlike Lowell's, is actually supported by the references that I cite and are ignored. Belief is finding a proposition more likely to be true than untrue. That's it. Anything above 0.5 credence is belief that the proposition is true. Certainty is belief approaching 1. Conversely, disbelief or belief to the contrary is anything below 0.5 in credence, and certainty in the negation is disbelief approaching 0. This leaves only 0.5 exactly as genuine lack of belief in either. Lowell's problem isn't that he denies gradation of credence, he explicitly concedes them. His problem is that he refuses to call those gradations belief, even when they function exactly as belief does. That's not science, that's semantics. When you accept the phenomenon but rename it to dodge the implication, you're not doing philosophy, you're running damage control. You are committing what I have dubbed in the nude atheism a pleading the question fallacy. The pleading the question fallacy is a hybrid of question begging and special pleading, which occurs when someone presumes the truth of a claim because rejecting it might produce an undesirable outcome. In essence, one presumes the truth of a claim due to a reduction or outright suspension of epistemic standards because of a desire to avoid an unwanted result. What you're arguing isn't just not supported by evidence, it's contradictory to available evidence. So rather than amend your position accordingly, you suspend your epistemic standards for justification. Amend the definition of the term belief so that you can then say, oh, I don't believe this because your credence doesn't approach the endpoints on the 0 to 1 scale. Your desire to avoid undesirable psychological and reputational outcomes is critical. Episticism, or absence of belief, or non-belief, or whatever the hell label you decide to use, cannot be scrutinized and subjected to the same epistemic standards because then intellectuals would have to forfeit the imagined and feigned sophistication and superiority derived from their presumed neutrality. It's not the label that matters. You can call that gradient's Bjorkensplork, as I offered in Atheism is Untenable. Then you get to say, oh, I don't believe it, I Bjorkensplorkate it. So what? If your Bjorkensplork functions in exactly the same way as belief, that's inconsequential now, isn't it? And to pretend otherwise is intellectually dishonest, ethically irresponsible, and epistemically bankrupt. You are the one playing the word games here by committing an ontological fallacy in a desperate attempt to define a mental state into existence in precisely the same way that religious people try to define their favorite deity into existence. Also, you can feign intellectual superiority over those gullible God-botherers. All you've managed to do is to substitute one unsubstantiated entity, a deity, for another, a neurological state. For all intents and purposes, that mental state is now your deity, and your fervent argumentation of it is its worship. It seems that while the office of the God concept is easily transferred, it is not so readily deposed. I have seen no more evidence of a genuine distinction between the dissent to a proposition and the assent to its negation that I have for any named deity. I have not even seen the possibility of this. In fact, I have over 100 arguments against it, supported by over 500 peer-reviewed, credible, scholarly sources. You have. Trust me, bro. No, I don't trust you, bro. And you've given me no reason to trust you. In fact, you've given me reason to distrust you by misrepresenting the studies you presented as evidence, by misrepresenting my position, and by misrepresenting my arguments. No one should trust you. Anyone who trusts you with your 2 misrepresented papers over my 500 faithfully presented citations isn't interested in truth. You aren't a skeptic. You just play one on TV.